Yeah, my original interest in these more secular forms of religion that was developed especially in the community of scholars of religion and society developed into different directions later on. And like I said, one of them was a curiosity about what some people called New Age. But what I learned from some of my work in the history of especially British anthropology was 100 years earlier called New Race. So that made it immediately interesting, right? The New Race was actually the term used by one of I think the second female president of the Theosophical Society, Anne Besant, who was then busy coaching Krishnamurti, who later became in the 1930s a global celebrity, as into his role as a spiritual leader and in fact a global leader. So what interested me about that whole longer process was something similar to my dissertation research, right? This is global religion. Spanning whole continents, right? People like Madame Blavatsky, right, the founder of the Theosophical Society, brought Hinduism and Buddhism to Europe to make it a fashionable thing among European intellectuals and spiritually engaged to practice or to combine with certain aspects of what a colleague of mine in religious studies in Amsterdam, Wouter Hanegraaf, called secular esotericism. And I got interested in that, in the longer historical sequence, but also in its current manifestations and in its effects on our present-day lives. And this resulted partly in a grant application that we got funded. I failed that grant application with two sociological colleagues of mine, both from Rotterdam, which was called Cyberspace Salvations. And you could already see how dated it was because we still used the notion of cyberspace. By that time, it slowly started to lose its appeal, you could say, to a lot of people interested in the internet. But we were struck by the fact that there was a lot of religious development around notions of cyberspace, but it wasn't purely religious. So the agenda that, in a way, Birgit Meijer and I already had when we convened this conference on magic and modernity was again continued with this question of, first of all, why not call this religion when there are so clearly religious elements identifiable in those processes? And B, what is secular if the secular is also in a way spiritual? How do they relate to each other? And one of the, paradigmatic cases is what scholars like Paul Heelas called the New Age movement, which, according to him, was founded on what he called the sacralization of the self. But of course, that self was by itself already a cultural element of a form of individualism that you could actually identify as typically modern and partly secular, right? The individual should decide for him or herself, usually himself, but anyway, right? And individualism was tightly connected to secular aspects of a capitalist society, because it could also mute into what people call the political philosophy of possessive individualism, which means that you are only an individual when you have something, right? When you possess wealth. which obviously identified white males in Europe as the most immediate candidates for being an individual and being a citizen. So this complex of intersecting spiritual and secular elements was part of our interest in cyberspace. And one of the most fun projects that I had the pleasure to supervise in that connection was a PhD thesis written by Doreen Zandbergen, who was also a researcher in that project, who actually charted the very intimate connection in say broader California, Californian culture in particular, between the emergence of the personal computer and cyberspace and forms of New Age spirituality. It turned out that a lot of the inventors of the computer were part of that whole liberation movement, right? That was taking place in the 1960s. Publications like Computer Lib appeared in, around 1967, 68, 69. Famous countercultural groups were contrary to what our popular history sometimes said, were very much into that kind of technology, but with the idea of an alternative technology, of a technology that could liberate and associate it against, you could say, in an antagonistic stance towards the technology that was associated with the State Department, the Department of Defense. So in those tensions, there's this ideology of a cyberspace that could actually become a place of redemption for human beings from the evils of modern consumer societies. Took shape, and it meant that there were very close connections between New Agey types of ways of thinking and the emergence of activities in cyberspace or fantasies about cyberspace. This raised my interest in science fiction, I had been, off and on a reader of science fiction for a while. And of course my interest in magic was to some extent closely allied, because the boundary between science fiction and science fantasy and actual fantasy is permeable, to say the least, if not almost completely absent. So what was so interesting in this project about science fiction was that the transformation of hackers from criminals into heroes had a lot to do with science fiction, and especially with so-called cyberpunk. And the central book in that respect was William Gibson's Neuromancer, which put forward this fantasy that cyberspace was an actual space into which you could move through certain, up until now, unknown technical steps forward. Right, fantastic book. There's a lot of great writing in science fiction in general, but especially also in cyberpunk science fiction. Of course, there's also a lot of rubbish, but that's everywhere the case. We use that very much in thinking about how do religious contents become reinvented through a process in which a certain type of technology plays a central role. And here again you can see my recurring interest in sort of global forms of religion that then get connected into different material forms of reproduction. Right, and that also clearly in this case led to what you could call an absolute fetishization of the computer. Right, there were a lot of people who simply didn't believe that this technology might have anything to do with anything but improving human life. They simply wouldn't be able to understand that it might work differently in a society that is built, for example, on capitalist forms of advertising, right? And we all know what the internet has turned into in that respect, and data mining and all those kind of things. So that was one phase of this mutating interest into religion and material culture. And in, charting different forms of fetishism. Another phase, a later phase, was another project in which I came to realize, because of this interest in science fiction, that, and that has to do a lot with the critical anthropology of time that I discussed earlier, that there is very little systematic attention to the role of the future in modern societies. There was a lot of there was a lot of futurology, but futurology usually meant we are going to think of what the future might have in store, and then we are going to try to adjust to that. But my anthropological way of thinking turned it around and said, I think that images of the future steer people into certain directions or make certain directions impossible to follow. Some things we can imagine about the future really determine our life, and some things that we cannot imagine means that we cannot follow up in certain directions. So this seemed to me to be an extremely important aspect of anthropology, that because of the emphasis on tradition in classical anthropology and always thinking about how people reproduce what they already have, made that we failed to really research and understand how people can construct different directions, new directions, how they conceptualize the new, and how that newness is related to the direction into which you want to be moving. And this had a lot to do also with the critique of anthropology, because I think it was particularly also my friend Achille Mbembe, whom again I got to know in the context of religion and society, who has argued, I think this was in an essay I read on the internet, but he's argued it in several places, that appropriating the future is a typical move in a colonial context. It is what colonizers do. They say, we are the future, you are traditional, and if you want to develop, you have to move in our direction. So I devised another research project and again got money for that, in which I said, I want to start comparing different forms of the future, different futurities. And I want to try to understand to what extent, say, the soil in which they are sown determines how they grow up, what they become. And I want to also to try, but I'm afraid that this part really didn't work out in the way I had hoped it would. I wanted to especially compare notions of development as one form of the future, very closely tied to policy as another form of the future, right? Policy is actually, this is what we are supposed to be doing we're supposed to achieve. And development policy is something that, is familiar to anthropologists in a lot of different guises and with a lot of critical background to it as well. And compare it then to images that are produced by science fiction, with the idea behind it that one of the advantages that science fiction writers have over development politicians is that they can think about disaster, right? Disaster sells because they work in a market, right? They work in a capitalist environment, but policymakers actually have the duty to make sure that everything goes right? Policy can't be wrong. Development can't go in the wrong direction, because then it's not development. I thought that comparison would be interesting. and we did, I think we did quite a lot of good empirical work, although some of it still has to be finished, still has to come out. But I was disappointed myself about what I could achieve, because I didn't really manage to, first of all, finish what I wanted to do, finish writing about science fiction. And I didn't really manage to come to a clear sense of comparison with development policy, because that it somehow didn't gel, and that was the result of the fact that I came to realize that there was very little substantial theorizing about the notion of the future, but also about its broader location in an anthropology of time. So, and this was another reason why I published that essay in Current Anthropology in 2015, which it's subtitled 7 Steps to an Anthropology of the Future. But more importantly, the main title is Modern Times. I hadn't realized how addicted modern people are to the future, and how different forms of organizing society generate that addiction. Think of insurance companies. Think of everything that has to do with the politics of security. Think of the biopolitics of hygiene and sanitation, which, you know, although they are good for a lot of people, are also very good for states to control their populations, right? So you, in a sense, via a route that I hadn't expected, I suddenly ended up deeply in a kind of, you know, Michel Foucault-like historical analysis of the growth of forms of discipline through ways of convincing people that these forms of discipline are good for them. And the future was a crucial element in that. But of course it also makes you think of all those people who are not able to take those directions, who have, as the punkers used to say when I was a student in Amsterdam, no future. Right? This is not our society. This is not meant for us. Think of all these young men from West Africa who end up right on the southern coast of the Mediterranean, wanting to cross to Europe. They all have a sense of no future, and they are right, because their societies don't provide them with one, or not with one that is sufficiently up to date to give them a job or give them any prospect of having a life. While at the same time they get a future imported through media, through the internet, that holds out to them that they are actually just as capable as other human beings in Europe, in North America, of generating the same kind of wealth and the same kind of lifestyle. So it became another way, a new way for me also of understanding forms of oppression, forms of you know, being underprivileged, but especially also of experiencing that lack of privilege. For example, through you know, being overwhelmed by images of a life that you feel is forever out of your grasp, right? These futures are not just available or non-available. In fact, they are all available, except maybe not for you, right? If you're a Ghanaian, urban, young, internet aficionado whose only way of getting wealth is to trick naive Americans into thinking that you're an attractive Ghanaian woman. Right, that's one of our students did research in a famous neighborhood in Accra, where these guys congregate, so to speak. Extremely smart in using computers, but no way of getting out of that place, right? No way of getting a job. It's amazing. anyway, that's you know, I was moving into the whole science fiction thing, and I did publish on science fiction, and I'm still going to publish on science fiction because, you know, while working on it, I was struck by the fact that science fiction is, you know, if you want to talk about an anthropology of modernity, that is more than just zooming in on the Netherlands or Canada or the United States or, you know, a single nation state. When you want to think about global patterns, science fiction is one of the more interesting things to look at. Because what is shared and what is not shared between different traditions of science fiction, and where science fiction is, for example, completely absent or nearly absent, that all gives you clues and indicators of the differential ways in which modern cultural aspects are being appreciated in different parts of the world. So one of the first things that struck me when I went back to actually seriously reading a lot of science fiction novels, at least those that I thought were important and famous, and is that the science fiction of Britain and Japan has the strange tendency to concentrate on strange dangers coming from the sea that threaten the island. In North America, there's very little of that. You don't find that at all. And of course, one of the most remarkable things about the fact is that actual techno-fetishist science fiction is North American, is USA. It came up at the same time that you know, Americans started to transform consumer societies by streamlining cars and you know, thinking of other extremely slick technical things that you could actually buy for your house and or drive in or whatever. And there's absolutely no coincidence that happened at the same time, and that it sort of culminated in the you know, the landing on the moon of the Apollo 11. But it's also, you know, interesting to see how different waves of science fiction writing select different things out of the available, you could say, imaginaries of modern societies. And one of the things that, you know, a lot of the cyberpunk writers, for example, said, we are a new generation of science fiction writers. Because we are no longer hooked to these huge technology, this sort of sublime technology of spaceships and rockets and ultra speed transport and whatever. We are more interested in small scale stuff like, you know, nanotechnology, the way nanotechnology might end up bringing whole computers inside your body that do strange things there, and you know, that whole idea of transforming into a cyborg, which of course was also an inspiration to many scholars that also inspired a lot of anthropologists, people like Donna Haraway, for example. But this self-image of the cyberpunk writers is actually not completely justified, because first of all, they did continue a lot of that sublime technology stuff. But even the sublime technology writers, the so-called golden age of science fiction, which is predominantly American, people like Isaac Asimov, Robert Heinlein, Arthur C. Clarke, you name them, most of them also published on new agey kind of stuff, which means not technological transformation, but mental transformation, ESP. So extrasensory perception, telekinesis, people who could move things with their minds, and the speculations about a new race, again, or a new kind of humanity that would evolve on the basis of those superior mental capacities, right? So, of course, you see that to some extent combined in figures like say Batman or Superman, or who have superpowers, but also usually with some kind of technical or science fictional aspect to it. So I became really interested in a much broader definition of science fiction, and then I came to realize all of a sudden that there's a lot of discussion about when science fiction actually begins as a genre in, you could sort of call it North Atlantic literature. It's no longer North Atlantic, right? You have science fiction films from Kenya now, and very interesting stuff being made in Southeast Asia, for example, South Korea. But when some of that emerged, we are talking mostly about France, Britain, Germany, and the United States. And then you realize, all of a sudden, you know, back to my old métier, so to speak, you realize that anthropology was part of the sciences that were fictionalized. And that was an essay that was published, I think, in 2018, in a book about magical capitalism, that I try to work out that when people take geography and the discovery of strange peoples as their main theme to fictionalize, you end up with what was written by some of the earliest science fiction writers in the middle of the 19th century. Usually ignored, not very well known, but very much present at the time between Jules Verne and Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. So that's my current interest, you could say.